But as far as fat and carbs, what kind of a role do they play when it comes to your training, your existence as a bodybuilder, your existence with trying to build muscle? What role do those guys play? How much should you have every day?
Yeah, and this isn't based on research. This would just be my opinion, but I would say a hard training bodybuilding lifestyle, I would, if I'm going to put this in percentages, I think probably around a 40-30-30, like a zone type of diet that your carbs don't have to be extremely high, that nor well, if they get too low, once again, we have anabolic resistance there as well. So I'm cautious about very low carbohydrate diets for muscle building. There may be some advantages for fat loss in terms of controlling hunger. But yeah, I like the 40-30-30, that somewhere in that range, that somewhere in that ballpark makes a lot of sense to me.
The reason I ask is because a lot of kind of amateur bodybuilders, people want to be bodybuilders, they seem to just have this opinion: carbs are the devil, carbs are bad, I gotta be lean, I can't have carbs, etc. And it's very misguided, because your muscles use glucose for energy. Now granted, they can get this if you're in ketosis, they get it a couple different ways, but the most effective way is with carbs. And if you're training intensely, each muscle only has a set amount of glucose inside of it, and when that's burnt out, it's burnt out. You can't train anymore, and that's about it. So you need to make sure that those stores are full constantly for when you go to train. And right after training, I mean, it's not super important, but right after training, you should also be consuming carbohydrates to replenish those as well. So I do advocate pretty high carbs, as well as a high carb meal before bed, as long as it's quick digesting carbohydrates, obviously. And so that's about it. In my opinion, you got to have fats, you got to have carbs, you got to have protein. You should have pretty damn high protein. Your carbs should be second, and in my opinion, fat should be third. But I like the 40-30-30. You said that's also excellent. But the thing is, it is a little bit subjective, person to person, what your weight is, what your muscle mass is, your actual intensity, sets, reps, training style. It's all very, it's complicated, and people don't like hearing that, but it is very subjective to an individual person. This is why a coach comes in if you don't want to do the individual research yourself. You got to get somebody that actually knows what they're talking about and how to help you, So
yeah.
How about, well, you could probably speak on this pretty well, I guess, but what's the difference between fat loading and carb loading? And would you mind giving I suppose a brief definition of each and who would use them?
Yeah, so I might need to have you confirm how I would define these, but fat loading, at least in the literature, that was a strategy for endurance athletes to just eat a lot of fat to train the body to rely on fat during endurance training. Carb loading would be kind of a similar approach, again, coming from the endurance-based performance literature. Carb loading was done usually 1 to 3 days right before a big endurance event. So from the research literature, that's where that data comes from. I think in our world, or let's say my world, of like a physique lifestyle approach, fat loading, I'm assuming, is just another way of saying a low carb diet. What is, when you say that, are you implying a short term or more of a lifestyle, weeks and weeks and weeks of a high fat diet?
I should have been specific, I suppose. I was specifically speaking long term with the fat loading, because some people do that. I suppose you actually could even go and call that keto, because I know some people do keto for that purpose. They just keep their fat really high to prioritize the mobilization of fat, the using of fat for energy. But again, you kind of covered it. It's for endurance people, long distance runners, I would say long distance hikers, even people in very, very cold environments, where like Alaska, where they're exerting a lot of energy. They have ridiculously high fat contents. I mean, you wouldn't believe how much fat they consume. Places like that. So that's good for fat loading. Swimmers as well, to a degree, if they're swimming long distances. There's been several people, very long distances, they did fat loading prior to that. It was very effective. Carbohydrate loading, I suppose I should be specific with this as well. There's a couple ways you could go about doing it. You could do carbohydrate loading following a depletion, trying to make your muscles pop for a bodybuilding show. They call that, the supercompensation effect, which to my knowledge doesn't actually exist anymore. Actually, I think that's actually been disproven, unless I'm wrong. You could get the same effect without depleting your muscles and then getting the carbs again. You would just keep going basically without doing that. But that's one way to do it. Another way to do it would be literally preparing yourself for a competition, as you said, 1 to 3 days, I think even up to 5 days prior, basically just eating a whole bunch of carbs, but they'd be the slow digesting kind. And then there's also carb cycling, which is carb cycling diets. I'm sure you know about those. Well, let's just speak about carb cycling because I think I covered the other two. Sorry. You want to talk about carb
Yeah.
cycling?
Yeah, so we did a study on what we called a carbohydrate refeed, and that was a diet study. And what we did was we had two groups of people. These were resistance trained males and females. And I think some people had referred to this as carb cycling. But essentially, one group went on a 7-week diet, and they dieted every single day. They never changed their diet status. They did have high protein, 1.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. The other group, we instituted, again, what we called a carbohydrate refeed, what others would call a carb cycle. And Monday through Friday, they were dieting. On the weekends, we took their calories back to maintenance, all in the form of carbohydrates. So they really had a lot more carbs on the weekend. During the week, though, they were in a 35% caloric deficit because on the weekends, it was 100% of their maintenance. So on average, it was a 25% caloric deficit, just like the other group. So at the end of the 7 weeks, and by the way, we had them track every gram of carbs, protein, and fat throughout the whole study. We watched every set, every rep in my lab. At the end of the 7 weeks, the group that did the carbohydrate refeeds actually outperformed the other group in terms of dry fat-free mass, and they also had more favorable outcomes with metabolic rate. So let me just, in 1 minute, describe. Did they lose more fat? No. Did they lose more body weight? No. Actually, I'm talking statistically speaking. So about the same with fat loss. But the group that went on the 7-week diet without any type of carbohydrate refeed or any type of carb cycling, they lost twice as much dry fat-free mass. And again, the reason I say dry, that means we measured their water and then we basically took that out, because when you're manipulating carbs, that has a lot of impact on the amount of water that also gets drawn into the muscle. So 1 gram of carbs will also carry with it 3 grams of water in glycogen. So we wanted to be very careful about controlling for that. So that's why we took water out of our equation when we measured dry fat-free mass. So yes, the refeed group did lose some dry fat-free mass, but it was significantly less than the other group. And not surprisingly, they also lost less, or they had less of a suppression of their metabolic rate. The group that did the linear diet, never taking a break, never doing a carb cycling, they lost like 80 calories per day. The other group only lost 40 calories per day. So it did seem like the carb cycling group, again, in a dieting environment, so this wasn't at maintenance, they had some advantages in terms of protecting their muscle mass, their fat-free mass, and then directly their resting metabolic rate.
I would think, I mean, you didn't discuss this, I know, but I mean, I would also think that the group that got I don't want to call it a weekend break, but the heavier carbs on the weekend, they probably did a lot better with training. They were probably in a much better mood, I would think. I mean, they even probably slept better. Or was there any difference?
Well, see, that's where we didn't assess sleep and we didn't assess workout quality. But I agree. One would think that their exercise. Now, there was no difference in total lifting volume. We did measure that, but were they able to go maybe closer to failure all the time without really feeling it? I mean, one would presume every Monday and Tuesday after the 2-day increase in carbs, they're going to have better workouts. The one hypothesis we had, and this is just a hypothesis, if you were to ask, well, why did that happen? I think the best explanation would be, and again, this is theoretical because we didn't measure insulin, but insulin is anti-catabolic. Insulin will lower muscle protein breakdown. And every day or every week for 2 days, they're not in a catabolic environment. They're back to maintenance calories. They're eating a lot more carbs on the weekend. So that's 2 days of keeping insulin high. So theoretically, if that's lowering muscle protein breakdown, that would protect muscle mass or preserve muscle mass better. And we did see that. So I think that's the likely explanation. And by the way, going back to our earlier talk, that's another advantage of having an adequate carbohydrate diet. You get the benefits of insulin, and insulin is very anti-catabolic.
Well, and another biggie too, I mean, I know you keep saying you didn't check the sleep quality, but I mean, when it comes to growth hormone and the release of IGF-1, I mean, if you don't get 3 full cycles of REM sleep, if they're interrupted, that doesn't even happen. I mean, it gets decreased by, I think, 60 some odd percent for 3 days. It slowly goes back to baseline, but it takes a long time to get fixed. And that's just with a single night of not getting 3 full REM cycles. You're supposed to be getting 5, so who the hell actually sleeps that much?
Not you.
Not me, that's for sure. I need to sleep more. I know I do. It's my biggest problem. I'm sitting there yelling at my clients, telling them to sleep. You have to sleep more. You're not sleeping enough. And here I am not sleeping enough every night. I know, hypocritical.